And now particularly India is being devastated by the crisis of the pandemic as it's hit more and more, thousands being affected throughout India at this point in time. And of course, we also see a dramatic change in the position of world relations developing as we've analysed in previous CWI broadcasts. We see the clampdown that's taken place in Hong Kong at this particular time. We see greater clashes developing around the world. We see a military escalation taking place in the South China Seas. We see a fundamental crisis breaking in the United States with a plummeting of support for Trump and a general deepening of the crisis. And of course, against that background, we see the intensification of the economic crisis and a tsunami of unemployment, which is now hitting country after country. And of course, today we're going to come back to the situation in Europe, and in particular, we're going to concentrate on developments that are taking place in the powerhouse of Europe, and that is Germany. Before we do that, I would like to appeal to all of our viewers to follow us and subscribe to us on our YouTube channel at CWI Media, and you can follow us on our website, of course, at socialistworld.net. But to deal with the issues that we're confronting today, we'd like to welcome to the program Sasha from SOL, Seoul in Germany. So a very warm welcome to Sasha this afternoon. And maybe we could go straight to the issue of the health crisis in Germany. Because we've had a lot of propaganda put around that Germany's managed the crisis very well. It's not a major problem. And of course, relative to what we've seen here in the UK with Johnson, what we've seen with Trump in the United States, what we've seen with Bolsonaro in Brazil and Modi in India, in a sense, it has been better managed, or so it would appear, in relation to the Merkel government in Germany. But I'm sure that's not the full story. So possibly, Sasha, you could outline the situation that did take place and the current situation, because of course we've seen some areas have been faced with new lockdowns, as we've seen in other countries as well. So Sasha, if you've got any comments on the health situation.
Yes, hello Tony, hello comrades all over the world. I think you're right that if you just compare the naked figures, Germany is in a better situation than many other countries. We have had 200,000 cases of corona and around 9,000 people died of COVID-19. But this was not because of a better or effective policy of the government. Actually, the health expert of the Social Democratic Party said we were just lucky. And I think that is true because as everywhere else, also in Germany, the reaction to the pandemic was much too late. If you look at the situation that in January, China, the World Health Organization warned of the pandemic, but only in mid-March were actions taken. And it's even worse. Back in 2013, the Robert Koch Institute, which is a major scientific institute, published a model for a pandemic of a modified SARS virus and warned of catastrophic consequences. But nothing happened. And in the end, Germany was lucky. It was hit later by the virus than some other countries like Italy and had some time to react. And actually, people here started practicing physical distancing even before the formal restrictions were introduced by the government. And as a consequence, we did have a situation where there was no overload of the health sector. That is true. But we also have to say that all the propaganda about how fantastic the German health system is, it's just not true. Because also here, it might be better than in Britain or the US, yes. But also here, we had hospital closures of hundreds of hospitals in the last decades. We have privatization, we have a shortage of 160,000 in terms of staff in hospitals. And there would have been a further deterioration of the health system if it wasn't for nurses and hospital workers struggling and striking in the last years to stop further privatizations and further deteriorations. I would say that the restrictions which we've seen here, they were obviously, in general, they were necessary, they had an effect. But I'm also sure that if the government had acted earlier, and in a more efficient way, some measures of the lockdown would not have been necessary in the way it was introduced, because it was really a sharp lockdown for the working class in regard to closure of schools, kindergartens, ban on meetings, ban on demonstrations, closure of restaurants and other institutions, and so on and so forth. But on the other side, the economy was kept running in almost all fields, not just in the sectors of the economy which were relevant for the survival of the population or the functioning of the health system, but arms factories continued producing as much as other industries, warehouses did. And in reality, the government pursued a policy which was based on the interests of the capitalist class to limit the economic impact as much as possible. From 45.2 million employees, 38 million continued to work through the lockdown. And obviously, they had a high risk to get infected. And then when the restrictions were lifted in May, again, it was done in a completely wrong way, putting the interests of the capitalists, their profit interests first. For example, car dealers were reopened before the playgrounds for children were open. Now, as I said, I'm sure that if they had begun, if they had acted earlier, especially with mass testing, then the situation could have been much less severe. Now, as you mentioned, there have been new regional lockdowns. What we see in particular is that it's not true when they say that the virus hits everybody equally. Because what we see now is that Corona knows the social classes in society. We have a situation where a recent study revealed that if you're poor in Germany, if you're on unemployment benefit, you are 80% more likely to end up in hospital with COVID-19 than the average of the population. And why is that? Because poor people generally are in a worse health situation and are more vulnerable. And what we've seen in the last weeks is that the virus has spread amongst specific sections of the working class. We have catastrophic situations in slaughterhouses, in meat factories, where most of the time it's migrant workers from Eastern Europe who are brutally exploited there and who have to live in extremely bad housing conditions. In one meat factory, more than 1,000 workers have been infected. And this led, as you mentioned, to a local lockdown of the city of Gütersloh, which was actually lifted yesterday by a court decision. But travel restrictions have been put on people who are living in that area. So the situation is open. Also, what we have is that in some poor housing estates, there are new hotspots of the virus, and the tenants are treated in a disgusting way. They are locked inside these buildings. Fences were built around these buildings, and actually the people who are infected and who are not infected, who live in these buildings, have to stay there, being locked inside these buildings, and not even with proper care or proper supply of food and medical care. So it's not a universal situation, and you really can say that it's the poorest strata of society which are still hit by the virus. Figures are going down, but the danger of a second wave obviously is there, and I think it's very open how it will pan out in autumn, especially given that they have opened the borders for tourism, which again is just on the basis of the economic interests of the tourism industry. And in that sense, I think Germany might be better off than some other countries, but it's certainly not a good situation.
No, so it's obviously far from a rosy picture. It's more a question of is it bad or is it catastrophic? But now maybe we could turn, Sasha, to the question of the economy. We have devastating figures globally being put forward in terms of the recession, which is hitting all areas of the world at this particular point in time. Many countries are already in a deep economic depression. And of course, Germany is crucial from the point of view of the future developments within the European Union and Europe in general. Now, I think there's approximately 800,000 workers employed in the motor industry in Germany. The motor industry globally seems to be being devastated. To what effect is that going to have a big effect on the German economy? And how do the projections and the current stage of the crisis in Germany compare to the impact of the 2007-2008 recession?
I think one thing which should be said is that in a way we are in a transitional period in Germany at the moment, in the sense that over the last months, everything was dominated by the virus and the fear for your health. That means also the thinking of the masses, the political debates were dominated by that. And this is beginning to change now, and the economic and social consequences of the crisis are coming to the fore. Having said that, I think it is important to stress that the economic crisis is not caused by the virus. It was underway before the pandemic, worldwide, but also in Germany. German industry actually was already in a recession at the end of 2019. And what we've seen really was the classical cyclical development of capitalist crisis after a 10-year long period of economic growth, which now has been dramatically reinforced by the pandemic. I would say up to now, the social and economic fallout in Germany seems to be limited, but this will change after the summer and obviously in the next year. The government has injected enormous sums into the economy to avoid a complete breakdown. But this is really only what they achieved. They avoided a complete breakdown, but they didn't avoid a sharp drop in GDP and the beginning of a rise in unemployment. Now, up to now, 600,000 workers have already gone unemployed, but up to 7 million are in short-time work. And if you just think, if only 15% of these 7 million cannot go back into their old jobs, that means another 1 million of unemployed. And already it's everyday news now that companies, department store chains, fashion store chains, airlines, many other companies have announced massive job cuts or even closures. And it is clear that in autumn, a wave of bankruptcies will come because the rescue packages, the money which was given to small companies will run out then, and many of them will not be able to survive. One headline of a newspaper just the other day said that they expect 2 million people to be ruined by the crisis. And there's no way Germany can avoid being hit hard by an international economic recession or depression, because the German economy is so much dependent on exports. Its dependency is well over 50%. And you mentioned the car industry, which is a decisive industry for Germany, but it's not only the car industry. Germany has a strong machinery, chemical industry, which are all very much dependent on export. In April, there was a deep fall in exports. For example, for the car industry, in comparison to March, it went down by 75%. And overall, the GDP in April alone fell by 10%. Now, the projection for this year is a drop of a minimum of 6.5%. This compares to 5% in 2009 after the so-called Great Recession. Talking about the car industry, different estimates say that 2.5 million jobs are dependent in Germany on the car industry. And here, obviously, the crisis was already on its way before the pandemic started because of the huge overproduction and overcapacity in that sector worldwide. And for the German car industry, on top of that, there are problems in regard to the structural changes in the car industry, the change to e-cars, where German car makers are lagging behind their competitors. Now, as I said, the government has injected a lot of money into the economy, but one difference to 2009 is that this is more of a synchronized global depression. And then back then, China played a certain role as an engine for the world economy and took a lot of goods, and helped the German economy at that time. This will not be the case this time, and I'm absolutely sure it's only a question of time that we will see mass layoffs and also closures of factories and workplaces. Now, at the moment, it's mainly the bottom layers of the working class which are hit: contract workers, low-paid workers in the service sector, but that will move to industry, no question about that. And also, obviously, all the money which they inject into the economy now will have to be paid back in the future, and it's clear that the government and the capitalist class will want to make the working class pay for that, and that's a recipe for social cuts and a tax on workers' rights. The employers of the metal workers, the Association of Metal Employers have already published a set of demands, which means drastic attacks on workers' rights, on the pension schemes, and so on. And tragically, the trade union leaderships are offering no fighting strategy at this stage, no political alternative to the capitalist model of dealing with the crisis, no demands for a shorter working week without loss of pay, no demands for nationalization of, for example, the car industry under workers' control, which would be necessary to solve the crisis. So I think it will take a while until movements and working class resistance will develop, but that is certainly on the agenda. And there are already, certain opposition developments also developing within the trade unions. My organization, socialist organization Solidarity, together with others, started a new network of left-wing trade union activists, which can be a platform to help the working class to find a way to fight back in the future.
So it's obviously a crisis in the process of developing, one in March at the moment. And to our viewers, I just remind you, you can not only find us on our webpage at socialistworld.net, you can follow us on Twitter at CWI Socialist, you can like our Facebook page, Socialist World-CWI, and you can also follow us on Instagram at Socialist World. But Sasha, we've also seen globally a major crisis and a collapse of support of many of the governments. Particularly that's the case here with Johnson. It's definitely the case with Trump in the US, and that's been repeated in a whole series of other countries. But we hear also that the Merkel government is in a relatively stable coalition at this stage. How stable is the government, and what's happening with the coalition partner, the Social Democratic Party?
Well, it is true that in comparison to the massive drop in support for some other governments internationally, that has not been the case in Germany. I think what we've had here is that often in times of a sudden crisis, which comes as a shock to the population, the government and the executive can be strengthened. The idea of we all have to stick together can develop. I think that this feeling in the case of the pandemic was even stronger. It depends on the individual behavior of all of us to act in a sensible way to fight the pandemic. Also, it must be said that what I explained before, the consequences of the pandemic were not as catastrophic in Germany as in other places. So the government could give the impression that it has acted decisively since March in the battle against the virus, and that then with the enormous sums of billions and billions of euros which it put into the economy, that it is now trying to help the economy. So all this helped the government. And it is true that in comparison to previous opinion polls, the government parties, the Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democracy, went up in the polls again. But it must be said from a very low level. In reality, they have now reached the level which they had back in 2017 at the last general elections, which is between 52-53% of support. It has mainly been the conservatives who gained in the present situation. The Social Democracy also won some percentage points in opinion polls, but from a very low level, and they are still under the result they had in 2017. So that means that while it looks more stable, while it is true that in the course of the pandemic, the government has won some support, from a historical perspective, it's on a very low level. Historically, these two parties would have had 70-80% in Germany. Now they are just over 50%, which means they just can hold on to their to their coalition. And the social democracy really is a joke. At the end of last year, there was a leadership contest in the party, and the more left-wing candidates won. But since then, it has become clear that they have not much to say within the party, and that it is really the more right-wing government ministers who can set the tone. It is true that trying to, get a bit of a more left-wing profile by demanding a higher minimum wage, for example, or by the demand to ban contract work from the meat factories. But while they are talking about a minimum wage of 12 euros, what has happened last week is that the minimum wage was raised from 9.35 euro to 10.45 euro in 2022. And this is much too low. It's so low that a worker on that minimum wage, working his full life, will end up with a pension under the minimum social security level. And the real pro-capitalist character of the social democracy has been symbolized last week when it was revealed that one of its former chairmen, Sigmar Gabriel is his name, had an advisor contract for that meat company, which was responsible for the new corona outbreak in Germany, and which is notorious for the terrible working conditions. And he earned 10,000 euros a month for that advisory position. Now, speaking about the political situation, in autumn next year, 2021, we will have the next general elections. And I think that the government will try to avoid generalized attacks on workers' rights and the social security system until then. If they can do that, is absolutely open. But already the situation seems to change. The latest opinion polls have seen a certain going down in the support for the government parties. And it's very unlikely, in my view, that they can hold on to that situation until next year. But as I said, we always have to stress 52% of what is called a grand coalition is not a big majority. And in reality, it is a reflection that the long-term crisis of the political establishment is underway in Germany, has not gone away, and that under the surface, there is a huge political polarization, which in the past was reflected in the growth of the far-right or right-wing populist Alternative for Germany. They have entered quite a crisis now because their incompetence has been really revealed through the corona crisis. But it also has to be said that once the pandemic goes into the background in the future, the social economic consequences come to the fore. If there's no strong left-wing alternative, then there is a danger of the right-wing populists to get stronger again.
So the stability is really quite a relative question, obviously. Now, you touched on there the issue of the need for a strong left alternative. Well, that poses the question, because in Germany, of course, you do have another left-wing party, Die Linke. How are they shaped up to this crisis? And what are they advocating at this stage?
Yeah, you're right. In contrast to the US or to Britain, we have a party left to the traditional social democracy, and that is good. It's good that we have such a party. But it also must be said that, as with other left-wing parties, whether it's the left bloc in Portugal, Syriza in Greece, or others, the German left party has really completely failed to meet the requirements of the new period which has opened up. And that is tragic, in my view, because this new period, which is a period of crisis, of enormous class polarization, of the development of political consciousness, will offer big opportunities for the left, for left-wing and socialist forces to grow in strength. In my view, if they withstand the pressure to adapt to the idea that the crisis can only be solved in collaboration with so-called progressive pro-capitalist forces. But this, unfortunately, is the dominant idea within the leadership of the left party, which is propagating in one way or the other to form coalition governments with the Social Democrats and the Greens. And in the beginning of the pandemic, the leadership of the left party, especially the parliamentary leadership, even praised Angela Merkel and came out in a general support for the line of the government how to deal with the virus. In Parliament, the majority of the left party MPs even voted in favor of the first rescue package, which was a rescue package mainly for big business. And those more critical MPs didn't have the guts to vote against it in Parliament. They just didn't go to the vote and stayed out of the Parliament hole. I think the left party is not conducting in a sufficient way. At the moment, it is part of 3 federal state governments. In the federal state of Thuringia in the east, in Berlin, the capital, and in Bremen, a city-state in the west. And really, during the pandemic, there has been no real difference between the politics of these governments, state governments, and the politics of other conservative or social democratic-led governments. In Berlin now, that coalition is even opening the door for privatizations of parts of the Berlin transport system, which already leads to protests, by the way, of trade unionists and activists in the city. And there were some terrible performances, if you like, by the leadership of the party. Even in regard to the anti-racist protests, some of the left party leaders ended up on the wrong side. We had a big demonstration of the Black Lives Matter protests of 50,000 in Berlin. And after the demo, there were a number of police assaults on black demonstrators. And the Social Democratic chairwoman, Saskia Esken, she said that there is a latent racism within the police forces. And the parliamentary leader of the left party criticized her for that statement and said no general charge of racism should be made against the police. And after youth riots in Stuttgart, which took place last week, the same parliamentary leader actually insulted the youth and defended the police. Now, having said that, we have to stress this is only one side of the party. There's another side. There are a lot of activists on the ground, active in different movements in the trade unions, supporting striking workers. Also, the party as such does that. And in a way, it's like 2 parties in one. But by many people by now, it is seen more like something like the left wing of the political establishment rather than an opposition force fighting for fundamental change, which, by the way, has given space for the right-wing populist Alternative for Germany to grow, especially in East Germany. Now, Sol members are active inside the left party. We see the party, if you like, as a possible step in the direction for a new mass workers' party with a socialist program. And we are fighting as part of the anti-capitalist left, the left-wing current inside the party, for a strategy of the party which is based on self-organization of the working class, which is based on how we call it extra parliamentary work, more than focusing on the parliaments. We're active in the youth wing, solid, and obviously we argue for a clear socialist program as an answer to the crisis which is developing.
So really, the Linke, unfortunately, has not come forward with anything approaching a really viable alternative to the government during the course of this crisis. Now, you mentioned there the riots that have taken place in Stuttgart. Now, that brings us to the question of the youth movements which have taken place internationally. We've seen the phenomenal movement of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. We saw how that was echoed around the world, particularly here in the UK. How did it impact in Germany, and what was the response of the German youth?
First of all, let me say that we have seen many mass mobilizations of young people in Germany, even before the Corona crisis, on climate change. Hundreds of thousands were on the streets, but also on racism over the last couple of years, and on the growth, against the growth of the far right. So there has certainly been already a process of politicization and radicalization amongst a layer of young people, even before the mass movement against racism and the police murder of George Floyd erupted in the US. I think one thing which will change in the future is that these movements were mainly on social issues, climate change, racism, and so on. What we will see now is that we will have more protests and movements coming on social and economic issues. I mean, during the lockdown, more than 40% of students lost their jobs. And it is clear that young people will find it much more difficult to get jobs or apprenticeships, and we will see a growth in movements there. Now, in regard to the Black Lives Matter movement, we had a tremendous spontaneous mobilizations. In Berlin, 50,000 took to the streets, but in many other cities, there were smaller protests and demonstrations in which we as SOL participated, intervened with a socialist program, arguing for workers' unity to fight the root causes of racism, which in our view lie in the necessity for capitalism to divide and rule the working class. There is a certain element in Germany that those protests were very much dominated by identity politics, which is obviously something which socialists have to challenge. Now, you mentioned the riots in Stuttgart, which happened 2 weeks ago. They were certainly of a specific character, but it is very telling that something like this happens in a country like Germany. Now, the background was really that probably over weeks, young people who were meeting on Saturday nights at a certain place in Stuttgart were again and again confronted with provocative police controls. And then the riot was triggered by a police control of a young person who was smoking marijuana. And obviously the whole frustration and anger about the experience with the police, but also about the general living conditions erupted. Now, many know the quote from Martin Luther King. He said, "Riots are the language of the unheard." And I think that is the case for this situation as well. We do obviously think that such actions do not show a way forward in the fight to improve the living conditions of young people, but socialists should raise the question why this happens and should offer a fighting perspective for young people. And obviously we have to oppose the attempts which are now made to use these riots to raise for racist scapegoating and also to strengthen the state forces. And in that sense, really what that showed is the need for a radical socialist youth movement. Our young comrades are developing a socialist youth program at the moment, which we will intervene in the coming protests which are in front of us.
Very important points there for the development amongst the youth. Now, Sasha, maybe briefly we could turn to the question of the international impact that Germany is likely to have in the sense of what's developing in the EU. We have obviously Germany dominating the EU economically, to an extent politically, but we have a major development of increased tensions taking place within the EU, particularly between the North and South. Only recently we saw a furore of an explosion of exchanges or ferocious exchanges between different EU leaders over the question of Poland getting a very high percentage of the EU Pandemic Emergency Recovery Fund, when of course it's been Italy and Spain which have been particularly hard hit during the course of the pandemic. And really it's a question what we'd like to ask you is, how do you see the future of the EU and of the euro? With these tensions growing, you see the process of deglobalization taking place internationally. There are major tensions opening up. Germany's caught in a bit of a prism. On the one side, needs its links with China. On the other side, may clash with China over its interests in the Eastern Europe as China tries to expand into that area. So how do you see the developments of the EU in the course of the next period?
Well, I would say that the EU during the pandemic showed its real face in regard to Italy. Because in the catastrophic situation which developed in Italy in February, Italy was left alone. No other EU country acted in solidarity, and it was down to China and Cuba to send support. And I think that shows, it's a reflection of what we as Marxists have argued, that the EU is not a suprastate, but it's an alliance of nation states, which all have and defend their own national interests. And that means that in times of crisis, these tensions, the centrifugal tendencies within the EU will grow. In reality, that is what we have seen after the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. That is what we have seen during the migration crisis in 2015. And that is what we see now. And I think it's very likely that these tensions will grow. And it's absolutely possible, probably most likely, that we will see a further breakup of the EU and the Eurozone, and that Britain will not remain the only country to go and break from the EU. But as you said, it's a completely new global balance of forces, and that is something which is in the process of developing, with a weakened US imperialism, strengthened position of China. And I think that will also increase the tensions within the EU, because probably some EU countries will discuss where to orientate to, whether to orientate more to the US or more to China. We have the example of Italy, which in 2019 has already joined the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which led to tensions within the EU. And in that sense, I think what we will see is a process of crisis and turmoil. As you said, Germany is the strongest power in the EU, and it profits from the EU because the EU means a free market for German goods, and the euro means a weaker currency than the Deutschmark had been in the past, so German exports are cheaper. So Germany wants to hold the EU together, but it also does not want to pay for the crisis of other EU states. And that is really, if you like, the contradiction in which German EU policy develops. Back in the euro crisis in 2012, when the so-called rescue packages were done for Greece and so on, there was a growing anti-EU sentiment developing in Germany, which really gave rise to the right-wing populists. And I think that can develop in the future again. But I think the German capitalist class wants to do a lot to keep the EU together. In the past, Germany was always opposed to Eurobonds. And now it has in fact agreed to an element of communitization of debts, which so far it always rejected. And I think that is a reflection of how deep the crisis in the EU is, and that there's panic amongst the capitalist class in Germany that the EU could break up. One CDU politician said, if Italy and Spain feel being let down by the EU, that would bring us close to a complete failure and breakup of the EU project. But I think that on the other hand, parts of the German capitalist class could think in the future that the EU becomes a barrel with no ground for the German capitalist class, and that the position of the German ruling class can also change in that process, and maybe at a certain stage they could be in favor of letting down, especially the southern European countries, maybe go to a smaller EU or Eurozone around countries which are economically more stable. But as I said, I think that from a political point of view, we have at this stage still a majority which would be pro-EU in Germany, but that can certainly change. We as socialists oppose the EU as an alliance of capitalist states, which simply acts in the interests of the capitalist classes of Europe. But we think we have to put forward a clear internationalist alternative to the EU, also in order to avoid a situation where the right wing can exploit the justified anti-EU sentiments which exist in the working class.
Yeah, so that's obviously an area we'll have to return to, because the developments within the EU are obviously of crucial importance for the working class throughout the whole of Europe. But Sasha, finally, maybe you could just explain to some of our viewers about the SOL. What are we advocating? What are we fighting for? And what have we been able to achieve during the course of this crisis thus far?
Well, our organization, Socialist Organization Solidarity, is obviously active on many fronts, as I explained before. We are an active part in the youth wing of the Left Party, in Left Party branches. We have, together with others in the trade unions, initiated a new network for fighting trade unions. But actually, during the lockdown, obviously, it was not an easy situation for us to maintain our activities, but we managed. We issued posters, leaflets, and our comrades were continuing also public activity as much as it was possible. When the trade union leaderships called off all May Day rallies and demonstrations, we, together with others in a number of cities, organized protests from below, and our branches are active locally in many campaigns. But obviously, the most important thing in such a situation is to give a political alternative. So it's not only about being active in struggle and in movements, but it's necessary to connect that to a political program for the socialist transformation of society, and to develop a program of demands, of transitional demands, which link that necessity of socialist transformation with present-day consciousness and present-day struggles. And really, during the Corona crisis, we had to update our program several times, given the very rapid change in the situation. For us, the most important thing always is to take a class point of view. We raise the question, who decides, in what interests, who pays for the crisis? So in the beginning of the Corona crisis, we put forward demands like the closure of all industries which were not essential, with guaranteed jobs and guaranteed payment of the wages in order to fight the virus. We demanded mass testing. We demanded that the state intervenes in terms of forcing on German companies to produce enough PPE. We demanded a levy on millionaires to pay for the costs of the Corona crisis. But obviously, we would always raise the question of how we call it the property question, and demand the bringing into public ownership of not just the health sector, not just the pharmaceutical industry, but really the big banks and corporations under workers' control and management to solve the crisis. Now, as the situation is evolving, the economic crisis becomes more relevant, and the main demand is that workers must not pay for the crisis, that there must not be any redundancies and attacks on workers' rights or social services. We are preparing for the wage round in the public sector, which can be a sharp conflict, because the employers have already said that they are not prepared to give more than the amount of inflation in terms of a wage rise. And really what you see is that all the applause for the so-called heroes in the hospitals and in the public sector, that it was worth nothing, because it was just applause, but no material improvements are given by the capitalist class or the government. So we would see our main task in organizing a force which is putting forward a clear socialist, anti-capitalist alternative, which argues for fundamental socialist change. And we're confident that socialism is the idea of the future, and that many workers and youth in the course of this crisis will draw anti-capitalist and socialist conclusions, and that it is most necessary for socialist forces to propagate these ideas in a confident way, swim against the stream maybe for a while, but then I'm sure that we will be able to develop and build a strong Marxist force out of that.
Well, thanks very much, Sasha. I think that's been a very informative interview we've had today on developments in the crucial country of Germany, which is going to be decisive in terms of how the class struggle unfolds throughout Europe, especially in the course of the next period. Now, before we go, we'd like to encourage our viewers to support us. Take a look at our Patreon, where you can subscribe with a monthly fee to donate towards CWI Media. All donations are, of course, welcome, but for £20 a month for your support, we'll send you our CWI welcome pack, including socialist reading material, CWI flags, and some other extras as well. To subscribe to become a patron, go to patreon.com/CWI-, which will be linked in the description below on the screen now. Additionally, you can make a one-off donations at paypal.me/donate to CWI, which will also be linked down below. If you're not in a position to make a donation, you can still support us by subscribing to our YouTube CWI channel. That's CWI Media, which we'd encourage you to do. And in the meantime, we'd urge you, if you want to get involved in the struggle for a better world, for a socialist alternative to this catastrophic era of capitalism that we've now entered, then you can contact us at our website at socialistworld.net, and we'll be back in touch and organise together with you in the struggle to build a real international socialist alternative. So thanks again for watching. We'll be back again next week with further comment and analysis on this international crisis. And in the meantime, be safe, keep up the struggle, and join the CWI.